Madam President.
The Majority Whip.
Madam President, many people think that Congress is irrelevant, unimportant, and wastes its time with floor speeches that go nowhere. Yesterday on the floor of the United States Senate, something historic occurred. Standing right back here, the senator, senior senator from California, Senator Dianne Feinstein, delivered to Congress and to the nation a report on the use of torture by the United States of America. Seated on this side was Senator Jay Rockefeller, who, as her predecessor and chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, initiated this investigation into the use of torture. Her speech, that lasted about an hour, was followed by Senator John McCain, who stood up and applauded her for releasing this report. It's worthy of note that what happened on this floor of the Senate yesterday was an assertion of constitutional principles that goes back to the founding of this country. It was an assertion of the three branches of government and their authority, and the authority of Congress to oversee the executive branch of government. And it got down to the most basics. Let's remember how we reached the point where this report was put together and delivered to the American people. Let me say at the outset that before I came to this job, I used to practice law and occasionally would go into a courtroom. I really waited for that moment when I could turn to a jury and say, I want to let you know that my opponent in this case destroyed evidence. And I want to let you know why my opponent destroyed evidence. Because what was in that evidence was so terrible that they would rather leave it to your speculation of how bad it was than let you actually read it. That is what started this debate that led to the report. Because you see, what happened was the Central Intelligence Agency destroyed videotapes of the interrogation of prisoners. And after it was discovered that they destroyed them, the Senate Intelligence Committee said, why did you destroy those videotapes? And they said, because Congress never asked for them. And the Intelligence Committee said, we didn't know they existed. At that point, the Central Intelligence Agency said to the Senate Intelligence Committee, we did nothing wrong. And we invite you, through your staff and members of the committee, to review the cables and emails within the Central Intelligence Agency which prove our case, prove we did nothing wrong. I think the CIA was surprised and shocked when the Senate Intelligence Committee took up their invitation. It meant, I understand, 5 years of work, reviewing some 6 million pages of information. Staffers from the Senate Intelligence Committee sat in what they called the cave, day after day after day, 2 of them, pouring through emails and cables to try to reconstruct what happened after 9/11, when the Central Intelligence Agency was interrogating prisoners. It wasn't an easy task. It was made even more difficult when we came to learn that the Central Intelligence Agency hacked into the computers of the Senate Intelligence Committee. It was a tough confrontation between 2 branches of government. And it's one that resulted, I think, in the right ending when Senator Feinstein and the Senate Intelligence Committee, following the lead of Senator Rockefeller, stepped forward and produced this report. I want to just reflect for a minute on how we reached this point. But first, let me tell you, this report concluded that the CIA repeatedly misled senior officials in the Bush and Obama White Houses about detention and interrogation programs. The report said the CIA falsely told the Justice Department that techniques like waterboarding helped to obtain life-saving information that kept our country safe. The report said the CIA detained more individuals and subjected more individuals to abusive interrogation techniques than it ever disclosed to Congress or to the President. The CIA did not disclose the use of brutal interrogation techniques that went way beyond what even the torture memo of the previous administration had authorized. It is worth noting what brought us to this point, and of course it was the tragic, horrible events of September 11th. The Bush administration, after that occurrence, unilaterally decided to set aside treaties and laws that have served us in the past. President Bush's White House counsel, then Alberto Gonzales, recommended to President Bush that the president ignore the requirements of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions were treaties that grew out of World War II, and they established rules of warfare to protect soldiers and civilians. These treaties were ratified by the United States of America. They are and were the law of the land. Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State under President Bush, objected to Alberto Gonzales's recommendation. He argued that we could comply with the Geneva Conventions, fight terrorism, and still keep America safe. Here's what Secretary Powell said at the time about setting aside the Geneva Conventions. This will reverse over a century of U.S. policy and practice and undermine the provisions of the law of war for our own troops. It will undermine public support among critical allies, making military cooperation more difficult to maintain. Today, Secretary Powell's words seem prophetic. Unfortunately, President Bush rejected Secretary Powell's advice and instead followed Alberto Gonzales's recommendations to set aside the Geneva Conventions. Then in August of 2002, the Department of Justice issued the infamous torture memo. The memo said abuse only arises to the level of torture if it causes pain equivalent to organ failure or death. The memo also concluded the president has the authority to order the use of torture, even though that torture would be a crime under U.S. law. The Justice Department of the United States also signed off on the use of torture techniques like waterboarding. This was in August of 2002. Thanks to the Intelligence Committee report, we know now that the Justice Department's legal advice was based on false information given to them by the CIA. I have a long history with this issue. It was almost 10 years ago I stood at this very desk and read into the record a graphic description of an FBI agent's record of abuse, of interrogation that she witnessed at Guantanamo Bay. At the time, I was criticized by members of the Bush-Cheney administration, but we know now that the description by this FBI agent was accurate, and what she described was authorized by the Bush administration based on false information provided by the CIA. It was 10 years ago that I first authored legislation to ban cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees. In June of 2004, America was shocked by revelations about what had occurred at Abu Ghraib prison. The Bush administration told us these were rogue actions of a few bad players. I introduced my torture legislation in 2004. I wanted to make sure and make it clear that America condemned the abuses at Abu Ghraib and stood by our commitment to the humane treatment of prisoners. But what we didn't know is that the administration had approved the use of abusive interrogation techniques in CIA facilities and at Guantanamo Bay. A Defense Department investigation later concluded that these techniques migrated to Abu Ghraib. I offered my legislation as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill. I expected it to be non-controversial. It was adopted unanimously here in the Senate. However, the Bush administration had it removed in conference. In the fall of 2004, I tried again. I offered the same amendment to the 9/11 Commission intelligence reform legislation. Again, my amendment was adopted unanimously by the Senate, and again in conference negotiations, the Bush administration removed it. I didn't understand their opposition to my amendment because the United States had ratified the Torture Convention, a treaty that prohibits cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, the same thing my amendment said. A few months later, I had the opportunity to get to the bottom of this. Alberto Gonzales, President Bush's White House counsel, was nominated to be Attorney General. During his confirmation hearings in January 2005, Mr. Gonzales told me that the administration believed that they had legal authority to subject detainees to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. That was the first time that a Bush administration official had acknowledged this legal loophole. The Washington Post called that testimony a gross distortion of the law and cited it as a key reason for opposing Gonzalez nomination to be Attorney General. After this revelation, Senator McCain asked me if he could take the lead on legislation that I had written to ban cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. I agreed. There was no better person than John McCain, who in service to the United States of America was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for more than 5 years, a person who had been subjected to torture because of his service on behalf of our nation. It became known as the McCain Torture Amendment. Despite a veto threat from President Bush, the Senate passed the McCain Torture Amendment in December 2005 by an overwhelming bipartisan 90-9 vote. And when the president signed the amendment into law, he issued a signing statement reserving the right to ignore it if he chose. Then in June 2006, in the Hamdan decision, the Supreme Court held the administration was required to follow the Geneva Conventions in its treatment of detainees. The court took the same position as Secretary Colin Powell had argued years before when President Bush had first decided to disregard the Geneva Conventions. In September of 2006, President Bush publicly acknowledged the CIA detention and interrogation program for the very first time. Then in July of 2007, President Bush signed an executive order stating the CIA's detention and interrogation program, quote, fully complies with the obligations of the United States, close quote, under the Geneva Convention and authorizing the use of certain interrogation techniques. Again, the administration twisted the law to justify the use of abusive tactics based on false information provided by the CIA. In October of 2007, the Senate Judiciary Committee held hearings on the nomination of Michael Mukasey to be Attorney General. The hearings were going smoothly until I asked Mr. Mukasey to condemn waterboarding as torture. He refused, and that became the focal point of the debate on his confirmation. On December 6, 2007, the New York Times reported that in November 2005, the CIA had destroyed videotapes showing the CIA's use of abusive interrogation techniques. The next day, I sent a letter to Attorney General Mukasey asking the Justice Department to open a criminal investigation into the destruction of CIA interrogation videotape evidence. I was the only member of Congress to call for that investigation, and in January, Attorney General did open the investigation. And the CIA's destruction of these videotapes is what led to this Intelligence Committee report. Then CIA Director Hayden suggested the Intelligence Committee staff review the operational cables and emails. The Intelligence Committee study was authorized on an overwhelming 14-1 bipartisan vote after the SSCI, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, found that the cables detailed detention conditions and interrogations far worse than what the CIA had previously described to the committee. The investigation led to the production of a report that is more than 6,700 pages long, including nearly 38,000 footnotes. It is based on a review of more than 6 million pages of CIA records. In December 2012, the Intelligence Committee approved this report on a 9-6 bipartisan vote. 2 months later, in February 2013, I received a briefing on this report before it was redacted. I was so disturbed by what I heard that I personally spoke with the President, then Secretary of Defense Panetta, and John Brennan to urge each of them to do everything possible to be briefed on its findings and support its declassification. In March of 2014, I sent a letter to CIA Director Brennan raising serious concern about the CIA's hacking of Senate Select Committee on Intelligence computers and urging, again, declassification of the report. In April of 2014, the Intelligence Committee approved the declassification and public release by 11-3 bipartisan vote. It is critically important that this report has been declassified so that the American people can understand what has been done in their name. It was inconsistent with American values, it didn't make us safer, and it must never be repeated again. Yesterday, Senator McCain came to the floor to support Senator Feinstein's disclosure. And during the course of his statement on the floor, he said, "Our enemies are acting without conscience. America cannot act without conscience." We are called to a higher standard than some because we believe in basic human values and in basic principles. And it may mean that some of the tactics used by our worst enemies are out of bounds for us, as they should be. What happened with this disclosure is an important reaffirmation of our separation of powers and our constitutional responsibility. I want to congratulate Senator Feinstein, Senator Rockefeller, every member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, but particularly those who voted to go forward time and time again. They were under immense pressure not to do so. But the fact that they have held the CIA accountable to the American people, to Congress, to the President, is part of our constitutional responsibility. It reminds people that in a democracy, the people govern, and the people have a right to know what this government is doing in their name. There's been a lot of debate since the release of this report, and I assume it will continue. But if it ends with the report and the press, we haven't done enough. We have to reform our processes. And let me start with Congress. I served on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 4 years. It was a daunting assignment. Virtually every hearing is behind closed doors and classified. No one knows you're even at the Select Committee on Intelligence unless you tell them afterwards. Testimony before us isn't available to the public. And most of the time, the professionals from these intelligence agencies come before us and speak in the acronyms of their agencies to the point where you can't even follow what they're saying. It took me 2 years of sitting there puzzling over what they were saying to finally get an insight into what the committee and its responsibility were all about. That's not right. We need to make sure that congressional oversight of our intelligence function is up to the job and up to the Constitution. That means more resources put in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. When I served, members of the committee shared a staffer. We each shared a staffer. We didn't even have one staff person working for each of us on these subjects. The amount of money that's being spent, tens of millions of dollars in covert activities and the like, needs to be carefully monitored. And as the chairman of the Select Committee on, the Subcommittee on Defense Appropriations, I have that responsibility to look at the overall budget on intelligence. There is not enough oversight. We need to make certain that our branch of government is up to that challenge so that we can guarantee the American people that we're doing our job, so that we can be held accountable as we hold the agencies, the intelligence agencies, accountable as well. I think what happened yesterday is going to be part of the history of the Senate, an important, positive part. And I hope that it's just the beginning, where both political parties come together and accept their constitutional responsibility. Mr. President, I have some tributes here to my colleagues who are retiring, are leaving the Senate. A lengthy list of tributes to Senator Tom Harkin from my neighboring state of Iowa, whom I work with over many years on so many important topics. I want to salute him for his service. The highlights of his service include the Americans with Disabilities Act, and of course the Affordable Care Act. His work on education and medical research are legendary. There was a time when Tom Harkin and Arlen Specter, Republican of Pennsylvania at that time, set out to double the medical research budget at the National Institutes of Health, and they did it. Lives have been saved. People have been spared suffering because they had the political determination and courage to achieve it. I'm going to miss Tom Harkin. Kay Hagan, my colleague from North Carolina, she's done an amazing job. In a short time in the Senate, her one term in the Senate, she really made a name for herself when it came to public service. She stepped up time and again and took tough votes, and I know it because as whip I asked her to take some of them on some important issues that have really made this a better and stronger nation. I thank Kay Hagan for being my colleague. Mark Begich of Alaska, I can't imagine how a senator from Alaska handles that commute back and forth, but he did it. I've said the other day when we spoke about his service that many people don't realize his father was a congressman before him and died in a plane crash with Hale Boggs when they were flying back to Alaska to appear at an event. That plane was lost and never recovered. When Mark Begich came from Alaska to serve in the United States, he completed the journey his father never could complete. His 6 years of service to Alaska have been extraordinary. I hope that his commitment to public service will continue for many years to come. Tim Johnson and I came to the Senate together. Tim from South Dakota eventually became chairman of the Banking Committee after he faced one of the toughest physical challenges any senator's ever faced, a debilitating brain injury that left him physically limited, but never limited in spirit and intelligence. Thank God, with Barb at his side, he continued in public service to serve the state of South Dakota. I'm going to miss my great friend, Tim Johnson. I wanted to say a word about three others on the other side of the aisle who are retiring: Saxby Chambliss of Georgia, Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, and Mike Johans of Nebraska. I got to know them when I gathered with one of these gangs, as they call them around here, to talk about deficit reduction. We spent more time together trying to explore this federal budget and ways to reduce our deficit in a thoughtful manner that we really got to know one another and respect one another. There's a world of difference in our political values and philosophies, but each of them in their own way made a positive contribution toward making this a stronger nation. Last night it was my honor to salute Carl Levin of Michigan, 36 years of service in the United States Senate. He's done so many things so well. As chairman of the Armed Services Committee, he's produced this contentious and challenging bill year after year, both as ranking member and as chairman. As chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, he really raised that subcommittee to a new level. He tackled some of the most complex issues of our day, particularly when it came to corporate abuse, spent the time to get the facts right, and then when he had a hearing, made an extraordinary contribution to the public dialogue about reforming our law and making us a better nation. I once said that when I was first elected to the Senate, people back home said to me, well, now that you've been in the Senate a year or two, which senators do you respect the most? I said then, and I'll repeat it today, that if I had a tough, important decision, one that I was wrestling over an issue or a vote, and I could only reach out to a couple senators at the time, I said one would be Paul Sarbanes of Maryland, now retired, and the other, Carl Levin. That's still a fact. And Mark Udall, my friend from Colorado and your colleague, Mr. President. As I said last night, I served with his dad, Morris Udall, in the House. His dad may have been the funniest public servant I ever served with. What a wit, what a sense of humor. And he once said, if you have politics in your bloodstream, only embalming fluid will replace it. Thank goodness the Udalls had politics in their bloodstream. Mo Udall, service in the House of Representatives, candidate for president. Mark Udall's uncle, Stuart Udall, who was Secretary of Interior under President John Kennedy. Tom Udall, Mark's cousin, the son of Stuart Udall, serves as senator from New Mexico, and Mark Udall himself. What a great person. I can remember so many things about his public service, but I remembered especially last night when he lost his brother and came before our caucus lunch and talked about the love he had for that man and what that loss meant to him. It touched the heart of everyone in the room and gave us an insight into Mark Udall as a person. He was committed to a number of causes. His wife, Maggie, and he have given so much time to the environment and preserving our natural heritage. But he also showed great courage when it came to his service on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Even as a new member of that committee, he stepped up for principles and values, and I'm glad he did, preserving our rights and liberties as American citizens and fully supporting the disclosure that Senator Feinstein made yesterday with her report. I've been in the Senate now for 18 years, and I've seen many come and go, but we have lost, sadly, in this departure of these members, some of our best. I'll close by mentioning the one whose fate was determined the last, and that was Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. She's been a great senator for Louisiana. She worked harder for that state and achieved more for that state than obviously the people of that state realized. There wasn't an issue that came before us that Mary didn't stand up and say, now let me tell you how that affects Louisiana, and usually make an ask, which was fulfilled. And let me add one other grace note when it comes to her personal and public life. Mary and her husband have adopted 2 children, and they're the light of their lives. And her dedication to the cause of adopted children has really made a difference, not just in the United States, but in the world. I'm sure she didn't get a lot of political reward for it, but thank goodness she put a big part of her life and her public life into standing up for the rights of adopted children and adoptive parents, encouraging it more and more so that kids would have a loving home as part of their lives. It was just one of the things that Mary worked on, but it was one of the things that I'll remember. I'm going to miss her and her service to the United States Senate. And Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.